A legislative push led by State Senator Zellner Myrie in 2024 to expand access to after-school care in New York resulted in a mandate for the Hochul administration to publish a report earlier this year on the after-school landscape, including how many kids are currently served by existing programs, the state's after-school capacity gap, and what it might cost to provide programming to all school-age kids. And while the report took a few extra months to be released, it is coming out this summer, and we're unpacking the findings and potential next steps with New York State Office of Children and Family Services Commissioner Dr. DaMia Harris-Madden. Thanks for making the time, Commissioner.
Thank you so much, David, for having me.
It's our pleasure. So for the purposes of this exercise that you were tasked with, when we think about after-school programs, what type of programming would qualify, and I guess what age of New York students are we thinking about? Because I have to imagine the priority is probably those kids who can't be left home alone and not necessarily so much worried about those 16, 17, and 18-year-olds.
Oh, we worry about them all, David. I can assure you our vision in OCFS is really to support every individual child and family so that they're valued and flourishing. So, we do care about the older youth, but again, for the purposes of this report, we did stick to children that we consider to be school age, which is from 6 to 12 years of age. I'm just going to start by saying what we all know, why after school is important. You asked about, a little bit about what we do with OCFS and our after school programming. We know that unsupervised time can lead to unproductive time. And so to the extent possible, we want our children engaged in activities that really support them, that prepare them for the future, that whether it's social skills development, career exploration, STEAM, art, sports. And when children are very young, we just want to make sure that they're prepared to maturate and also reach eventual adulthood. So that also means the safety component, right? Making sure we have places where there's a decreased likelihood of, getting involved with the lures of the street, so to speak. So we want to always promote the physical, emotional, mental, and psychological safety of our children, particularly during those bewitching hours of 3 to 6 p.m.
Well, a lot of those goals sound similar to what people expect from childcare more broadly these days. So, what is the relationship between an after-school program and maybe childcare more broadly? Are they part of the same continuum? Should one be thought of as a separate issue? I mean, how do you try to wrap your head around them?
So, as someone who has developed after school programs for many years and also evaluated them, we absolutely see after school as part of the continuum. Governor Hochul has, invested heavily, yes, on the childcare front, because we know there's just so much unmet need as it relates to our, infants and our youngest children, but also in after school programs, because at the end of the day, our parents need to keep their jobs, right? And we want our children to be productive and everyone needs to be less stressed. So, to your point, yes, after school is a part of that continuum. And so, for many that are involved in the child care and after school ecosystem, we absolutely know that there is a relationship.
Well, the report that your agency came out with found that the current after-school programming capacity during the academic year in New York is about 500,000 slots, and that leads to a capacity gap, given the amount of school-age kids in New York, of over a million kids right now. And we can talk about how to address that gap, but for those people who are serviced by the existing provider network, how are they getting care, and what are they paying either out of pocket or with the help of state or local governments or school districts to make that care possible? I mean, what is the current landscape a product of?
Certainly. So I'll start with the first, which is the capacity question that you asked. It was, at the highest range, 1.15 million that we ascertained from a number of archival data. The reports that are out that suggest that, our young people are engaged to tune about 500,000. However, I think the definition of after school varies. So we have to take that into consideration because the design of a program, the dosage of a program, all pretty much varies. And so at its lowest end, we actually see a gap of 390,000 students or children that are not engaged versus the 1.15 million. So I think this report does a very good job of giving us that range of where there is unmet need. To your question regarding the calculation of costs, after school can be costly for some, and in some cases, after school is completely free thanks to government support, philanthropy, and other, possibilities. So, on average, the medium cost is about $6,000 according to this report, but it could also be lower than that. Again, this report does a really good job at looking across New York State and saying, okay, what is the highest amount we could possibly need to get to, let's say, a place of universal after school? That could be as high as $11 billion.
Yeah.
But it could also be as low as $1 billion. It all just depends, again, on the many variables to include geography, again, program offerings, what kind of expenditures you need in after school. Some places need transportation. Some people need custodians,
Mhm.
security. It all varies. So I think the aim of this report was really to provide us with a tool so that we can dig deeper and really get to actual costs, because it's really difficult to do a predictive analysis when you have so much variation. But this tool, this study, is really going to be used to help us to kind of look at what the next steps would be. But it's definitely not a roadmap. I want to make a distinction here
Hmm.
because, it's not something that we're looking at as a necessary guide. It just was information that was presented based on what data was available at that time.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce you. For listeners just joining us, I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're speaking with Dr. DaMia Harris-Madden, the Commissioner for the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, which recently put out a report on the after-school landscape in New York. And I want to come back to the current system and who's served by it, because often when we think about childcare, it's typically people on the very low end of the income spectrum who are able to access government subsidies, and then you have people on the very high end who don't think twice about digging into their pocketbook to pay for some of the most pricey care, and there's that people in the middle who often are struggling to figure out what to do. Does that same dynamic play out in terms of after school care, or does it look different in terms of who is able to fill those, say, 500,000 plus spots?
I think you're absolutely spot on, David, that there's a lot of variation between the costs in the different regions. And again, the difference in terms of the program design and the quality of care. You're absolutely right that this study did look at the cost of implementing after school programming in New York State and the cost borne by families and municipalities, which again can range anywhere between, $0 to $6,000. To your point, there are many government subsidized programs. We're very fortunate in New York State that we are one of 10 in the nation in terms of performance, where we have more than 35% of our children engaged in after school, and that's according to national data. So I think, the investments that have been made, and when you speak about, the early childhood and after school and the continuum, we look at programs like the CCAP program, for example, where Governor Hochul has continued to invest. This year, she has an increase of $3 billion in our CCAP program, which is a 40% growth for OCFS. But it's important to note that at least 40% of CCAP is utilized in after school.
Hmm.
And some people really don't know that, but that's a huge part of it. So when they hear CCAP and they hear subsidy, they automatically think of the 0 to 5 or 0 to 3 range, whereas CCAP also supports, our young people that are our school age.
So right now there is this emphasis in terms of making pre-K more widely available, and this means those kids under the age of 6, but for the purposes of this school age, children are defined as under the age of 13 and at least 6 years old, or enrolled in kindergarten or a higher grade. Do you have a sense of what sort of population we're missing then when we take into consideration the broader landscape of after school needs, if we aren't capturing those maybe 4 and 5 year olds?
Well, as you know, if we're focused on CCAP and its expansion, which is different from obviously the pre-K and pre-K3 and pre-K
Hmm.
4, CCAP again covers the wide gamut.
Oh, sure, but
from
I just mean for the purposes of this report, when you guys looked at school-age children, it was that range of 6 to 12, and I'm curious then if you feel like you're missing a meaningful population by using that definition of school-age children when trying to assess what's going on in the after-school landscape.
I don't think we are, David. And the reason why I say that is because when you're looking at 0 to 5 and sometimes 0 to 6 from the, early childhood stages, again, we have the infrastructure that has been heavily invested in through the CCAP, $3 billion, for example, for this year, 11 billion since Governor Hochul has taken office. And then when it picks up for when you enter kindergarten and, advance up to about middle school, right? There's then the apparatus for after school through a myriad of funding streams that exist in New York State to support those children as well. So I don't think that we're missing. I think that we're just distinguishing the two populations for many, many
Mm.
reasons. Obviously, regulations and safety reasons, we separate the children out, like ratios, for example, for 0 to 5, very different from our children that are, 6 to 12 and so on. So I think that we're not missing. It's just that this is what the study charged OCFS to do, and we wanted to make sure we made good on what the legislature asked of us.
But safe to assume, though, we can't assume that 4 and 5-year-olds can get off the bus, give them a pint of ice cream and the TV clicker, and just leave them alone, right? Despite how much they might want that
Absolutely
autonomy.
not. At mother of three here, absolutely not.
And after a quick break, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. DaMia Harris-Madden, the Commissioner for the State Office of Children and Family Services, which put out an overdue report in June on the after-school landscape in the Empire State. When we get back, we'll talk about some of the pots of money available for after-school programs in New York, the academic year restrictions on this report, the implementation of after-school initiatives, and how this report might inform future efforts to bridge existing capacity gaps and realize universal access to after-school care. Support for the Capitol Press Room comes from O'Donnell and Associates, a public affairs firm providing strategic guidance to businesses and nonprofits on navigating policy and regulatory issues. More information is available at o'donnellsolutions.com. I'm David Lombardo, and you're listening to WCNY's The Capitol Press Room. We're continuing our conversation with Dr. DaMia Harris-Madden, the Commissioner for the State Office of Children and Family Services, which put out an overdue report in June on the after-school landscape in the Empire State, which highlights existing capacity gaps as well as the potential cost of achieving universal care. We'll pick up our conversation talking about some of the streams of money that existing after-school programs are funded with.
We will always maintain that an 8-year-old can't supervise themselves, again, which is why we invest heavily in our after school programs, whether it's through the LEAPS funding, where the governor, allocated over $100 million, our positive youth development, where we saw a sizable increase the first time in many years, let me tell you, for positive youth development, our sports and education funding, not to mention, our boost programs and other methods through OCFS alone, and then looking at New York State Ed Department, which relies on federal funding, such as the 21st Century Community Learning Centers, and then New York City, for example, who's just had another heavy investment for their Compass and Beacon programs. I mean, taken in totality, we do have a robust funding system here in New York State. I think one of the deficits, however, is kind of like the data sharing and governance, which is also highlighted in our report. There's no centralized system, so to speak. So it's really hard to assess or predict, how much further we can go at this point, because we just don't have all of the information from every single government source that provides subsidy and support. Again, absent from the report is also private funding. So that's another task that would need to be done, analyzing how much support we receive from private donors, for instance, and they contribute greatly. And then there's the parent share as well. So I think, after school becomes very complex when we're looking at the costs and its feasibility as you try to think about possibly going universal. But, again, this report was just a first step. It's just a tool for us to use that I think that we could really build on. And certainly the advocates do their own digging and data analysis and will, I'm sure have, some supplemental information to lend.
I do imagine they will have additional comments and thoughts. But in terms of how you want to use this, and you were very clear that this is not a roadmap, what are the next steps that could be taken using this report?
I think if we look at the history, and I've only been here for a couple years now, feels 2 days feels like 2 years feels like 2 days. I could say that. I think that just like anything else, it's been, a multi-year approach. The governor has invested, if you look at childcare since she started, but over time continuing to invest, and it's a multi-pronged, multi-year strategy. I think the same vision can be applied here with after school. We are, going to be looking closer at the data. The report is relatively new. It also doesn't include some of the reports that came after, not to mention the, ever-changing federal landscape. We just don't know what's going to happen prospectively. So I think for us at OCFS, this was a really great starting place that we could actually look at what the possibilities are. Like I said, the great range in terms of what the unmet need is it's just so dichotomous. It's hard to really wrap your brain around it because in one figure you'll say 1.1 million, the other 300 and some odd thousand. So again, it's a tool to be used to, really be able to assess what we're doing in New York State, how we can communicate better with our partners, and then where we go from there. I'll also say that, part of this report really does speak to how we think about after school. I don't know that many people really take that into consideration. A sports program might look very different than a fully comprehensive program. Like, for example, when I was in the municipal level of government, I started with one program, expanded to 13. We included everything from architecture to, swimming to, building drones at a time when drones was not a thing to, performing arts. Just really is very varied. And I think that this report truly underscores the dynamicy of after school and how and where we could possibly go with it.
Well, sticking with that idea of what after school care can look like in its varied forms, what about the length of after school care? Because when we're talking about universal after school care, are we talking just for the academic year, or is this something that is expected to extend through the summer?
I love that question because that's again what I'm speaking to in terms of definitions. So, for the purpose of this report, it looked at the school
Hmm.
year, after school hours during the school year, and not the summer months. And oh my, when you start to look at summer programming, and many of which do leverage some type of after school fundings, for example, 21st Century Community Learning Centers, you can use year round. There are other funding streams that allow for that to happen, right? It looks very different when you're crafting a summer program or you're offering summer programming versus after school programming. But for the purposes of this report, it was confined to after school year.
You mentioned with that overlap of childcare and after school care, how a portion of the CCAP money, the Child Care Assistance Program money, goes toward after school. There have been concerns about the flow of that money and some of the wait lists that counties have experienced. And I guess when you think about the implementation of after school care, is that something that needs to be done in a county by county or even more specifically regionalized approach? Or is this something that will be more broad and more state focused?
So for the CCAP program, because it is administered directly to the
Hmm.
municipalities, it is managed by the local departments of social services. There's eligibility requirements, and as you know, we're very proud of the fact that the governor has expanded eligibility to the statewide medium income, which means more families can access more of the subsidies. family of four earning up to $114,000 versus when my children were coming up and it was about $50,000 for family four. So we've seen a lot of growth there. I do think that, as we start to look forward, in terms of how we administer after school, we have to look at, what is being made available from the private sector too, because as you know, with public funds, there's usually a linkage back to the federal government. And in some cases, it's the state funding that is made available. Sometimes there's in-kind requirements. When I was at the county level, our funding mechanism was in part county levy dollars as well as private as well as state. So I think it all just depends on how the programming is developed and the what's allowed in the after school program in terms of your budget and your expenses.
Well, finally, sticking with the idea of flexibility, the state, at the governor's behest, is implementing these three pilot programs for childcare at the county level. Are those opportunities to test things out in the after-school space as well, or are you focusing just solely on childcare more broadly, which, as we talked about, does include after-school, but maybe won't be necessarily the focus or get any sort of special experimental treatment with this?
No, the pilots are aimed at 0 to 3, some instances 0 to 5, depending on where you are. So, for example, in New York City, the $73 million that was allocated towards 2Care, which is a contracted care system, is for, 2-year-olds because they've been successful at implementing 3K and 4K. Whereas in other parts of the state, there hasn't been quite the amount of movement for the 3K and
Sure.
even 4K programming, right? So then that's focused on 0 to 5-year-olds, and it's really based on what those counties need. And so at this point, I don't believe it's relative to after school, because it's focused on the 0 to 5 age group.
Well, we've been speaking with Dr. DaMia Harris-Madden. They are the Commissioner for the State Office of Children and Family Services. Commissioner, I really appreciate you making the time to talk after-school care and look forward to talking with you more about this issue and all the other different things under your purview in the near future.
I thank you, David. One of my favorite topics. So it's really been a pleasure.
Support for the Capitol Press Room is provided by New York State United Teachers, a statewide union of nearly 700,000 professionals in education and healthcare.